I would first like to talk about the new historicist perspective which Karen Codden expresses and how this rationale relates to the changing tide of criticism on Hamlet in the latter part of the 20th century. What we have with new historicism is a type of criticism caught between the Marxist principles of aligning the text with an innate social movement and that of the postmoderns who sought to debunk systems of binaries entirely. The new historics aim at situating a text within its political and social realm and usher in a view of the text which characterizes it as something which is in balance with the historical facts. Historics believe that the text itself is not something which is able to breach the bonds of the period of history which it was manufactured in. So what we see with Codden's argument is Hamlet situated in the realm of Elizabethan England. We see local politics in negotiation with the elements of the play, particularly but not limited to characterization and plot. What we are also asked to look at in Codden's essay is an exchange of ideas between Elizabethan viewpoints of authority, the role of the subject, and how subjectivity and inward thought lead to a sense of paranoia by governments or authority. The new historic approach allows us to look at more than a direct relationship between a historical figure, here we are given Essex, and the protagonist of the play, Hamlet, but we are offered a critical lens which gives us an understanding of the cultural, social, and political influences which are ingrained in the text of the play. As we look at Codden's essay, we will want to discuss three main centers of meaning in Codden's criticism. The first we will look at will be political disobedience is madness. The new historics would argue, and Codden follows suit, that political disobedience begins internally, which is crafted into a state of paranoia by governments. Secondly, we will identify subjectivity in the subject, and how King Hamlet's ghost in the new historic approach is the inner voice of Hamlet, which is the voice of self which authority fears. Lastly, we will offer an hypothesis on Hamlet's delay. Codden will offer that the delay in action exists as an attempt to overthrow the government. Hamlet's delay in action is necessary to identify the volatile internal self, which then combusts to form outward political and social tyranny. So we should begin by looking at how political disobedience can be identified as madness. Codden first offers that what would be deemed a historical parallel to the text of Hamlet. We should begin on page 383, halfway through the main paragraph of the page, where Essex is said to have entered unannounced into the bedchamber of the sovereign. What we notice here, and what we render from the first portion of the account of the Earl of Essex, is the notion that the threatening of the perceived identity of a figure of authority is a threat to the crown itself. Perception, and in particularly memory of perception, is that which attains obedience. What we see in Mac's chapter is a statement on page 115 that discusses how apparel or dress or perceived outward appearance largely defines the individual. However, leaving the humanist argument behind, Codden goes further and notes that this perceived authoritative being, in Essex's case, the sovereign, is disengaged from the agency of sovereign, and therefore authority is lost when she is viewed as simply a person. But what we see in Codden is that the preservation of the appearance of authority of the sovereign is just as necessary as the perceived subjectivity of the subject. The dividing line, the gray area in between perception and the truths of the internal self, is where madness lies and where the distrust in both parties exist. What Codden is saying in response to that is that the appearance of normalcy, the perception of submissiveness by a subject, is cause for paranoia by government. We also see this in an explanation on page 388 where Codden invokes Foucault and proves that madness itself cannot be directly related to the overthrow of governments, just as a figure of literary text cannot be in direct parallel with a figure of history, but what he refers to as a fissure in the structure of authority. So what we see is Elizabeth's reaction to this violation of the perceived self is this fissure Codden talks about and the appearance and subjectivity of the sovereign. This is what Codden refers to as confinement, or in this case, execution to avoid the usurping of authority. In Hamlet's case, as we see on 384 and into 385, we notice that his eventual death is necessary to preserve the power relations, which must exist in the political spectrum that the play is situated in. What Mac quotes is saying that The question will be, as with madness itself, how much is studied, how much is real, points to Cotton's argument that the perception of madness as political disobedience is based around the question of how the self is perceived. The self is something, in Elizabethan England, that is defined by the nature of the political authority which is in power, namely the sovereign. The self of the subject is altered based on the role of politics and religion as is identified in the time leading up to the crisis of accession. It is this perceived self, the outward appearance of loyalty, but the inward crisis of rebellion, which is the main source of contention of governments. The fear of this inward crisis of rebellion and the desire to control the subject is illustrated on page 391 in Claudius's reproach of Hamlet. What we see here is an attempt to draw Hamlet out of this state of reflective mourning, the obsessive nature of his grief which is deemed as dangerous. The inwardness here provokes paranoia for the crown, which is perceived as rebellious madness. The source of madness is indicative of the play itself, as is referred to on page 389. Discussing contemporary critics, Cotton makes one major claim that the break between subject and society is equivocal rather than absolute. What this shows is a new historic approach is there is no stable text as a text alone. A text cannot rise above the power structure that it was written in. The political superstructure and the dynamics of power are evident in both the factual nature of history as well as the fictional limits of a literary text. So now that we have talked about political disobedience as a source of madness, we will move briefly into a discussion of subject and subjectivity, which will then lead us to Hamlet's delay and a final conclusion. If, as Cotton explains, madness is the mighty opposite of the ideology of government, then we are at a juncture in this discussion about where the source of madness lies in Hamlet. If political ideology is ingrained in every text, and if every text is in conversation with stipulations of authority, then we are left with the main argument regarding subject and subjectivity on the bottom of page 389 going into 390. What we see here is a conversation about the dangerous aspects of one lingering in space, and how the subject linked to the specter of a former self, whose public form he reassumes in dying. Mack would argue that the universality of dying and the mortality of Hamlet is a common theme that audiences can identify with. However, what we see with the new historic approach is that the level of the threat transgressive is in direct reference to Hamlet's relationship with the ghost of his father. Cotton notes a passage which is the center of meaning for this argument on page 393, stating that the ghost is aligned with madness and breaking down the pales and forts of reason, emphasizes that our understanding of Hamlet's ghost should be that it is the inner self of Prince Hamlet, the conscious within, the very structure of consciousness, and the self which authority fears, which we see as the relationship with the ghost. We see in the passage from Act 1, which appears next, that Hamlet is in dialogue with himself, a conversation which, as Elizabethan subjects would engage with internally, that there is an understanding that the rebellious struggle with authority is one that will lead to madness. So what we see as the primary function of the ghost is a break in the boundary between subject and subjectivity. The ghost gives us the insight we need to argue that Hamlet, through the ghost, is in a dialogue with himself about his call to action. According to Cotton, the ghost serves as the internal voice of self, the precursor to outward aggression, which precedes violence against authority. The last point here, where both subject and subjectivity merge with political disobedience and madness, is argued through Hamlet's delay. What Cotton is debating with on page 392, and what I believe to be the main line of reasoning in the argument, is that Hamlet's internal self is reflected through the ghost, which leads him to take action against the crown. At first, as we see in the passage from Act 1 on page 392, Hamlet questions the logic and form of the ghost, which is, in effect, him questioning his own inwardness. Ophelia, who Cotton claims is a source of outward madness, aligns with the language of the ghost. The rhetoric of the ghost is how the play achieves a sense of belonging under new historicism. It is through the language of the ghost that Hamlet sits in this delay, which Cotton believes is simply a device used to initiate outward rebellion. So as we move from Mack's humanist approach to the play, we see Cotton's approach as one which defines the political power structure of Elizabethan England. What is absent here that we would say in Wofford's article is an excuse for Hamlet's delay. What the new historic approach would lead us to believe is that his delay is innately based on an Elizabethan construct of an argument within the inner self as a means of political discontent. The discontent is the nature of the paranoia of government. In Hamlet's case, we see a figure who is in conversation on the stage with the ghost, which is representative of the inner self. Situated in the political atmosphere of the crisis of the accession, we do not see Cotton's approach as one of a mental state, as Freud and Bradley have described, but one of conflict of inwardness leading to madness, which then invokes an outward violent rebellion.